Voilà, bonjour à tous. Ne va pas
Hello
tarder,
everyone.
j'imagine.
Jacques will
Voilà,
join us
tout
soon.
d'abord, je suis très heureux de vous accueillir
First of
pour
all,
la seconde fois ici à la
I'm
Chaux-de-Fonds, dans le
pleased to welcome
L'heure
you
bleue.
once again to the
Un
theater
lieu
of
exceptionnel
L'Heure Bleue in La
qui est
Chaux-de-Fonds.
classé.
It's a
Euh,
heritage
Juste
site.
quelques informations avant de donner la parole à Jacques.
I'm just going to give you a few
Dans
pointers before
vos sacs
I
que vous
hand
avez
the
reçus à
floor
l'entrée,
to Jacques.
vous avez
You
une
received
pomme,
a bag.
également un
In there,
questionnaire
there's an
pour
apple,
ceux,
but there's also a questionnaire.
qui sont des entrepreneurs. C'est pour une étude sociologique
For those of you who are
de
entrepreneurs,
Manon.
this questionnaire is
en
for
fait,
sociological study by Manon.
si vous avez un peu de temps dans la journée, n'hésitez pas à le
If you
remplir
have
et puis
some
il faut le
time during the
rendre à
day,
l'accueil.
you should
Voilà.
fill it out, please, and then
Sinon,
give it back
pour vous dire un
at
petit
the
peu,
desk.
pour introduire un peu le programme, donc certainement que vous le connaissez déjà.
I'll present
cette
the
journée
program a
est
little bit. I'm sure you've
particulière
already
parce
looked at
qu'on a
it.
voulu lui donner une thématique
Today is
en lien avec la ville
a
de la
particular
Chaux-de-Fonds.
day.
Donc, vous
We
savez, c'est
have
l'Anthropole
a
horlogère.
theme that's
Ça a
linked
été,
to La Chaux-de-Fonds. As you know,
encore,
this is a
une sorte de
watchmaking
capitale
metropolis. It
de
used to be and
l'horlogerie en
still
Suisse.
is a capital
puis,
for watchmaking in Switzerland.
Avec les discussions qu'on a eues avec la ville, mais également un intérêt d'un certain nombre de
We
personnes
were in
l'année
talks
dernière.
with
On s'est
the
dit que
city,
c'était
and we
vraiment
also
l'occasion
spoke to
de
people who came last
créer des
year,
ponts, de pouvoir faire
and it made us
connaissance
see that
avec cette industrie
this would be an opportunity
qui
to
est
really
une des principales industries de
create
canton de
ties
Neuchâtel,
with that industry,
avec
which
la
is the
nôtre,
main
cette
industry
petite
for the whole
et
canton.
de
It would be
réfléchir
useful
ensemble
to create relationships
aux-
between watchmaking and Bitcoin,
aux choses qui les
the
rapprochent,
two
mais aussi les
industries,
différencient.
and to reflect on
L'horlogerie, c'est pas tout à
what
fait la même
binds them
chose,
together,
mais
but also what separates
en
them.
tout cas, on est là pour en débattre, pour en discuter.
We're here to
en
discuss
toute,
that.
Décontraction, vous connaissez
It's
un
a
peu
casual discussion, as you know,
l'ambiance que j'essaye
if you already know the
d'insuffler,
Bitcoin Paradigm
pas de
Conference.
stress. S'il y a
You
un
know
autre
the
problème,
mood
vous vous adressez
I
sur un
like.
t-shirt blanc avec
I want there to be no stress.
Je remercie les sponsors.
If you have any question, you
Voilà.
can talk to people who are wearing a white shirt, who are sponsors, and I thank
Il
them.
y aura 3 panels.
There will be 3 panels today.
Qui abordera en fait le génie de la machine.
One is
Alors,
about
c'est
the
un mot
genius of the
mystérieux,
machine.
Mais l'idée c'est de
That might sound a bit
de trouver ce
cryptic,
qu'il y a de génial dans un ensemble
but the idea of that
qui
first
est
panel
Bitcoin,
was
mais qui est aussi
to
une montre.
find what is
Ensuite,
the
on
genius
va
of
s'intéresser, on va zoomer
the
sur la
consistent
montre et
system
on va
that
se
is
zoomer
Bitcoin
sur
on one
Bitcoin,
hand
où on va
and
essayer de
watchmaking
faire
on the
des
other.
parallèles entre,
Then during the second
les-
panel, we'll try to draw
les
parallels
éléments plus petits qu'on
between smaller
utilise
components
mais également
that are
l'utilisation
machined
sur Bitcoin.
in watchmaking
En fin
and
d'après-midi,
smaller
on
components
débattra
in
de
Bitcoin.
l'axiome de la valeur, c'est-à-dire d'où provient
And then in
cette
the third
valeur
panel this
qu'on
afternoon,
nous
we'll
montre,
debate
mais aussi
about the axiom of value,
la valeur qu'on attribue à
the
Bitcoin.
value that we attribute
introduire
to
tout ça,
watches and to Bitcoin.
Je voulais avoir quelqu'un
And to set the stage a little bit,
d'exceptionnel,
I wanted to invite
de cultiver,
an exceptional speaker who also
un
happens
peu
to
cette thématique,
have vast
par
culture.
conférence. Jacques Favier
Jacques
va
Favier
faire,
will introduce
cette
our
introduction.
theme.
Je vous remercie d'être là et puis on va
Thank you all for being
bien
here.
s'amuser toute la journée.
I think we'll have fun
Je vais
today.
passer la parole à Jacques. Merci.
And I'll hand the floor to Jacques now. Thank you.
On va y aller. Alors, il a décidé de m'embêter. Pourquoi est-ce qu'il se met forcément en zone. Quelqu'un a une idée de ça?
Does anyone know why it's going to zoom immediately? We did rehearse this morning.
Bon, on va faire comme ça. Tout le monde m'entend?
Right, we'll proceed as is. Does everyone hear me?
L'introduction, je peux gagner un temps précieux en vous disant qu'on va essayer de
So I could save time by telling you that, quite simply, we're going to reflect together on what time, gold, and Bitcoin have in common, and reflect on what kind of food for thought it gives us.
Finalement, elle était essentielle.
I realized that time is essential when I was thinking about this. And watchmaking is as much, if not more, a source of reflection on modernism, the role of the state, value, and money than the printing press or the reform. You know that people often go back to Gutenberg. We all like a sole inventor. And you know this idea that you go from Gutenberg to the Reform to Protestantism. That's kind of a simple way to frame things. Everyone knows Weber's thesis about the ethics of Protestantism. But looking at watchmaking and how those communities evolved, I thought was also a great way to think about the evolution of money and value and Bitcoin. What mortals have had in finite amount always has been time. Maybe you know this quote. I'll let you try to find the author. The quote is, "Gold is the flesh of gods and time is their abode." Now let's think about this. Is time really money? Antiphon would have said this in the 5th century before BC, before Christ. This would have been at a delicate time in the life of the city of Athens. But I think this idea that time is money is more a moralistic analogy that everyone can quote with a different context. Antiphon is what we'd call a hedonistic libertarian. And I think he found it stupid to lose time that could be used for leisure in working like a slave. I think he thought he had better things to do with his time. We have a quote of what he said through Plutarch, who lived 5 centuries later, and who's more rigid. When Plutarch wrote the life of great men, he quoted Antiphon, but he situated it as time that was lost and that could have been used for action. And then Benjamin Franklin, who needs no introduction, who's one of the fathers of the modern economy, and who came from a modest background in the US, had to work very early in his life, and he found it useless to lose an hour that could be used for business. And all of this was before Taylorism and the timer. These thoughts were also before Marxism. I'm not going to delve into Marxism now, but let's remind ourselves that for capital, time is also wasted time. That's why it frowns on the cigarette break. And these thoughts also predate the idea that, like we're going to see this morning, time can be measured like value and it can be sequenced. And it also predates the idea that money and time can be decoupled from tangible realities that can also be mechanized and made into math. Now, with this, oh dear, I shall be too late, I put up the illustration of a Lewis Carroll pocket watch.
Alors, ça pose la question, est-ce qu'on manque du temps?
When Lewis Carroll's
Est-ce que
rabbit
on est à l'heure
appears,
comme on paye ses dettes par
he
correction,
is late. He's running out of time.
sans revenir au débat?
Are we trying to be on time the same way we try to pay debt out of politeness?
Le texte d'Aristote, c'est aussi une
Aristotle
affaire de
spoke
temps,
of
parce que
chromatistics,
c'est
and in his work, it's as much about time as it is about money. We know there'll never be a 25th hour, and there won't be a 22nd million of Bitcoin, but there'll always be a tomorrow for the usurious moneylender, or for the one who can't pay his debts. So we're faced with scarcity of time and of money, and that can lead us to budget or to use Taylorism, but it doesn't preclude us from thinking a little bit in philosophical terms. And before we delve into the mechanical plane of things, I'm going to go into philosophy. In St. Augustine's Confession, we read, "What then is time? If no one asks me, I know. If I want to explain it to a questioner, I do not know." That's something that applies to money. Some speakers say, some speakers like to remind you that as a kid you didn't know what money is, but as an adult you know. But what I would like you to remember is that the drops of time are precious. So remember those drops of time. Just like what keeps and measures value, what keeps and measures time is first found in nature. In the morning, you may be woken up by a rooster instead of an alarm clock. Just as to know how much time you need to cook an egg, you might have a timekeeper, but neither the sand clock nor the rooster, neither the glass hour nor the rooster really give you exact time. And like the Greek phrase says, tapantare kauden menei, everything flows, nothing stays. The same water is never found twice in the same river. The idea, though, is that by capturing the flow, you may measure the flow of time. That's the idea behind the liquid hourglass.
Vous remplissez la clepsydre d'eau, vous faites un trou, vous mesurez l'écoulement, notez que la clepsydre a une forme évasée qui permet de contrebalancer l'effet de la
device was used for this. You would pierce a hole in it,
une unité de temps qui est le saut.
And you had at least a measure of time, which was the flow of water out of that bucket. This was a way for the ancient to measure the flow of time. And going into the flow of the river and down to the riverbed, you could also find golden nuggets, as you know, and not just gold, but also quartz. So those minerals that today help us tell time were found in nature originally. The calculation of days, time, season is an inextricable compound. But from the starry sky to the Babylonian moon, to Rasbarg and the Egyptian sun, and the calendar, including the Gregorian one, the sky is what governs our years and days, and our months and weeks. Of course, it was approximate, which was a problem for the ancient ones. And I really like the idea of a celestial body, because metal resembles the stars, and so the knowledge derived from these perilous treasures is also the knowledge from the world. And this, again, is not a phrase by me, is by Michel Foucault. mathematical language describes nature. And whether you're looking at the sun, at stars, or at the moon, you have to do math. The moon doesn't give time easily. You have to build a volvel. Does anyone know what that is? I spent 2 hours trying to understand how it works. Some tried to build it again. It's very technical and it's extraordinarily inaccurate. It's crazy how much intelligence was put into such an inaccurate device. And with the polar star and the Big Dipper, it's even worse.
L'heure inégale qu'on appelle des Babyloniens, qu'on ferait mieux d'appeler des Égyptiens, si on se réfère à la citation précédente. Mais tout le monde sait qu'avec un cadran solaire,
the sun with its dial gives the uneven hours of the Babylonian. So the sun gives time, but the hours are uneven. In summer, the hours are long, they're short in winter, etc. But before doing math, we need to remember one thing. We need to change the numbers, and this will only happen in the 12th and 13th century. And look at watches. Watchmakers aren't able to land on whether to use Latin or Arabic numerals. The two celestial bearings to tell time aren't more exact than using the two different metals.
Un fondement métallique, c'est-à-dire jusqu'au milieu du 19e siècle, les
Until the middle
entre la valeur
of the 19th century, bankers will be torn between the value of gold and the value of silver, just like before they were torn between using the sun or using the moon to tell time. And then we have this watchmaking revolution in the 13th century, even though it's hard to pinpoint who specifically is to thank for this. And it progressively imposed even hours, which replaced in the 15th century the uneven hours. But the sundial persists. You can Google the former engineering school of Grenoble. There's an exceptional heritage piece. It's in the huge main staircase, and it's really in 3D. A sundial that was created in 1673 by the Jesuit Jean Bonfa. However, at that time, it wasn't useful at all anymore. So it really was art for the purpose of art. And once again, we have a feat of intelligence that is completely uncorrelated to the practical use of it. Once again, we have something much more costly than a simple watch used for the exact same function. So I am struck by this way of making art for the sole purpose of art. And here, a quick parallel. The British counted with guineas, which represented 21 shillings. And there too, nothing justified maintaining guineas, just like nothing justified maintaining sundials. But, and this is a preview of what I'll say about machines. Let's take Japanese hours. I've spoken a lot about the Western world, but that doesn't prevent us from looking a bit further afield. Japanese hours resemble more the uneven hours of the Western world, and they had their own machines. machines have imposed even hours compared to the uneven hours of the sundial in the Western world. But the Japanese managed to create machines for uneven hours. So we see that technology is able to take in stride any aberration as long as it's to fulfill a social purpose. So can we really ever not take into account the social demand? Now, this was approximate. Accurateness was a social convention in a way. But we see that we could also accept inaccuracy if society deems it okay.
Pardon. L'heure intègre toujours une convention sociale.
Hours always factor in a social convention. It's the case of the hour of Shabbat. Shabbat is pinned to the sun setting, and it actually lasts 25 hours more than 24, and it's been used for a very long time. Then the Italian hour, that's something interesting. It starts half an hour after the sunset, which means that, first of all, it's not easy to verify, and it changes every day. It will nevertheless be used in Italy in some contexts until the middle of the 19th century, even a little bit later. In the Cathedral of Florence, you have a beautiful watch clock, which is adjusted to the sun setting, and the hours are also counted backwards, which means they're anti-clockwise. The needles are going anti-clockwise. It's complicated, it's useless, it doesn't really fit international relations that Florence had with the rest of the Christian world back then, which shows that the idea of social conventions matters. Then there's the Bohemian hour. This was during the Holy Empire. And that was an hour pinned to the sun rising. There was a distinction made between hours from the sun setting and hours from the sun rising. The Bohemian hours had the same inconvenience in that what it was set to changed every day. And then you have the French hour, which became widespread from the 15th century onwards. And there was with it the beginning of noon or midday. The idea was that it's the time when a stick has no shadow. And the idea was to start time not at noon or midday, but at the opposite, which is at midnight. This is what spread progressively but slowly. And I hope no one here is from Basel. I'll say that the hour from Basel is a simple war tactic from a time that the Bitcoin's enthusiasts like, a time where the French and some people from Zurich attacked the city of Basel. The Basel people had captured a Byzantine general. They knew that the attack would happen at noon, and one of them decided to change the clock. The clock created panic among the French, and this wasn't a success for them. That hour was kept for decades and even centuries. Then you know of the saying, midday sharp. It created an explosive standard because the cannon in Palais Royal would ring the triumph of the French hour. But there are a few problems. Sun midday time in Paris or here in La Chaux-de-Fonds is not that precise between the sun midday of Friday, Saturday, or the following Sunday. There's not necessarily 24 hours. We don't necessarily have that 24-hour interval between all of these sun middays. So there can be slight variations, and the cycle is complicated. Another problem is that the sun kind of noon in Paris is not the same as in Dijon or Geneva. But the Paris population will remain loyal to that sun midday. And then we have the revolution of the 13th century and mechanical time, and I insist on the word mechanical time. There is when we sequence time into pieces. You remember the liquid hourglass. From the 11th and 12th century onward, the Chinese had a huge hydraulic clock which measured the continuous flow of water. And this was supposed to be a great invention, but we lost the plans, which meant that it couldn't prosper. And in Europe, watchmakers tried to make a wheel that would turn exactly according to the movement of the equinoctial circle. This mechanical clock was something that gave rough, inaccurate, and unreliable time, yes, but it was the interesting direction. It was promising, and it really was the start of a revolution. The revolution came from an assembly of expertise. That's what I heard once about the common thread between watchmaking and Bitcoin in La Chaux-de-Fonds, is that they all are communities of experts.
Le développement de l'horlogerie mécanique, ça ne peut pas se faire totalement sur des îles, même si ça ne se fait pas non plus.
This is something that's worth dwelling on, because you can't really progress in silos. The community of experts imposes communication networks. Sometimes it's friendship, sometimes even marriages, and it's a dense network.
Le génie de la machine ici, c'est blocage des blocages.
The genius of the machine here is the blocking of the block and release. So the time is divided in pulses, which helps counting them, enabling them to be counted, and then it transmits this count to indicator. And this comes after the counting of the pulses, so very quickly people will understand that everything that causes a pulse, everything that is oscillating is a clock. Then it would take 500 years to go from bell tower clocks to marine chronometers, so from public time to private time. But the 13th century revolution was at the origin of everything that followed. Time, like money, is first of all political. Clockmakers, I hope there are no liberals in the room. The Chinese water clocks proved the legitimacy of power, and in China, understanding the calendar was a sign of sovereignty. But like I said, it is the Western world and the mechanical clocks that ended up prevailing internationally. Louis IX sent William of Rubruck with a mechanical clock. In the Western world, the princes and the powerful, different forms of powerful men use their coats of arms and titles, and they put them on public clocks, which are works of art, which are prestigious items, but also standards in a way, because if my clock at home does not match the public clock, I have to go and adjust according to the public clock. I said that the canon didn't resolve all the issues if the deviation or the span between two strikes isn't adequate. It makes things difficult. So we will see the emergence of the average noon, so that there is always exactly 24 hours between each noon. So it will be done in Geneva in 1780, and there we can see that Paris was a bit late. So the adoption of the average noon was done 40 years later, even more. But time can also resist to political power. And so this is linked to the social convention aspect. Political power has some clout over time. And let's note that since Roman time, there was no name for hours. There were always a mathematical nature to them. Moving from Roman to Arabic numbers, we can simplify calculations, but there is another simplification that was imagined by the French revolutionaries, and it seemed legitimate, and that was the decimal time. The decimal time, you can see it here with a clock that has the symbols of the Republic. So you have the time out of 10, out of 12. But it is a Swiss clock that was built by Isaac Droz in Geneva, but he may not have sold many copies of this clock, because I think the 10-hour system never really worked or took off. It's in observatories that the regulators remain. That's one term that we have in common between finance and watchmaking. The Paris Observatory gives time in the form of a clock that can be used for adjusting your own watch, and then there will be an electric clock and then a telephonic clock. But during the whole of the 19th century, the Parisians remained loyal to their small cannon, because everyone wants the time in their pocket, and the transition from mechanical clocks to pocket watches represents a lot. It is a combination of technical feats by clockmakers. I do not want to do the history of watchmaking, but you know that there has been movement. It was born in Italy, then went to France, Switzerland, England, and back to Switzerland, but with different conditions. Then America, Japan, there were always watchmaking powers. But very often, there were technical steps that led to changes in the rules of competition. This is something that's difficult to follow when you're not a watchmaker. It involves springs, spirals, fusees, inventions that are, for many, very ingenious, and they will help put the clock of the cathedral within someone's pocket, even though they're on a sinking ship. It would never have been the case without the social demand for it, and without the adaptation of dials, because the dial is what we hope, this is what we will focus on, see what the customer wants. The watch will become an item that is well known and intuitive enough for great watchmaking brands to integrate that the dial can be just an image. In passing, I heard that younger generations, when they see a traditional watch, have trouble saying that it is 2:45. Because of the digital era, they will tend to say that it is 45 past 2, because they're used to the digital display. Just like there needed to be some adaptation when we moved from one currency to another, from the French franc to the euro. This happened in 2 years, and because of the constraint, eventually the change was understood. So the pocket watch completes the privatization of time by domestic clocks. When you see the dial rotating, you have more of a feeling of wasting your time. And from the 18th century, we start carrying watches the same way that we carry our phones today. In Guillioz, the king of the Lilliputians, sent his soldiers see what the giant has in his pocket. And the report from the Lilliputians is that the Lilliputians say, according to our conjectures, is either some unknown animal or the god he worships. And he called this his oracle. It is he who sets a time for all the acts of my life. So watches has crazy prices today. It can be a wedding gift for noble women. Some noble women received so many watches that they could use them for the weddings of all their friends afterwards. But it was interesting to see that workers could, or factory workers would sometimes buy cheap turnips to keep an eye on the clock within the factory. Because when you are working in a factory, you can suspect that your boss has tampered with the clock in order to exploit you. There are issues of privileges, unfair competition, rivalry, and we also see the emergence of secret signatures. Here you can see a Breguet watch, where you can see the Breguet, but when you see the actual watch, if you don't know where the signature is, you will not notice it. And also there was still no blockchain technology to track those beautiful items. Two things will be brought about by the political time: space and speed. Single tracks. Let's remember that trains appeared with single tracks, and so it was difficult for trains to pass each other. It was only possible at points where the track were divided. It was an area where there was kind of a reversal phase of the infrastructure, and those single tracks required that railway workers use regulators. That's why many of the watches you see on eBay belong to railway workers, because it was of strategic importance to organize those passing of trains. This is also linked to the time when time left. If the train leaves at a precise time and you're not there at that time, then you will miss the train. For the Geneva Tower, up until the 19th century, so it used to provide 3 times: local time, Paris time, and Bern time. Large-scale standardization goes through trains. And one thing that's as well established as time zones came from railway on the initiative of the United States. It was validated by US law in 1918 and then extended to other places. Standardization of US banks only happened in 1913. The US was developing quickly, and with this huge territory, the US could not have dollars in all cities, so they could not be an hour for each city, since cities are linked to a network. So the conclusion is that Usage is king. In 1884, the year when the French had difficulties with their Parisian meridian, something that was not well prepared, the English and the Americans imposed the Greenwich time because 65% of ships had adopted the Greenwich time. Time remains an instrument of control. The daylight saving time is invented by Benjamin Franklin, who thought that Parisians spent too much in candles. In Brussels also lived under the German time in 1914, as well as occupied France from 1940. And the daylight saving time was imposed with more difficulties in the US. And the European Parliament has blocked the decision to scrap the daylight saving time since 2019. Moving on to the crazy time of the Bolt Soprano, there were many ameliorations, but when the English clock strikes 17, Mrs. Smith says it is 9 o'clock. So, in those conditions, the clock strikes any kind of time, but we realized that there is no more value to time than to some types of currencies. Last part, looking for a continuous model, the model of the chronometer, that will rely on the discovery of quartz. The second hand appeared in the 1690s, perhaps to take the pulse of patients. But thanks to the invention of the pendulum clock, with a pendulum used as a regulating oscillator, it's possible to build clockwork mechanisms with a variation of less than a minute. So astronomers, but also sailors, for the task of calculating longitude. Latitude is easy to calculate, but calculating longitude is quite complex from a mathematical point of view. So you need to be as accurate as possible. And also, racehorse owners needed more accurate instruments. So there was a real demand that will lead watchmakers to make new discoveries, for instance, the spiral core spring, to carry clocks on ships. And so at the end of the 19th century, it was possible to reduce the deviation to 100th of a second. Coming back to what I said, clocks remained accurate enough to reveal irregularities in movements of bodies that were always considered as the basic chronometers, that is, the Earth itself. Then dividing second to the 10th decimal, I think it's less than the Bitcoin, so the eighth one, so it's better. But what's important here is that it's decimal, because remember the failure of the French revolutionaries. The second wasn't divided into 10 by 10 or 24. So this is required for sports competitions or astronomers, but it is something fundamental. And there is no spring that allows to do that. But thanks to research and nature, several things were discovered. First of all, the discovery of piezoelectricity, so the discovery of an ideal oscillator, quartz, used as a resonator and radio frequency controller. And so since everyone wants to work with radio, there is a fight for frequency bands that stimulates research. Quartz regulators come from this research, and they become better than marine chronometers. They're followed by atomic clocks, working with the isotope 133 of cesium, and the second is now the duration of 9,192,631,770 periods of irradiation corresponding to the transition between the two hyperfine levels F3 and F4. So that's why we arrive to the good hours of physics, the Greenwich Mean Time, appears to be insufficiently accurate and reliable. In 1955, the first atomic clock and a global system will be developed, the International Atomic Time, provided by atomic clocks. In 1972, Coordinated Universal Time was created and synchronized with the International Atomic Time. I'm not sure I understand the acronym here, but this UTC, so Coordinated Universal Time, is corrected according to atomic time, but there is the issue of the second that was fixated, but we realized that this was the second of 1920, so there is still an archaic element of revolutionary processes, but the planet is slowing down. This is just a fact. That means that the actual second is becoming longer. So we correct with an additional second the 61st second of the last minute of the 31st of December 2016. It happened 27 times since 1972 at the request of the International Earth Rotation Reference Systems Service, which is still at the Pavillon de Sèvres. So the question is, should we align to the sun or forget about it? You would like alignment with the sun, since this governs your daily life. The UTC systems helps having this alignment with the sun, even though the Earth is slowing down, but this also allows us to keep the 1820 second and what was defined according to the amount of pulses for the 133rd. However, this leap second is just a grain of computers, and especially as the date of the next leap second cannot be predicted with any certainty. So the more we progress, the more we solve problems by creating new ones. So abandoning all solar references would seem natural for satellite positioning systems such as the GPS, which already use continuous time. One funny thing is that those debates are contemporary with those about the debasement of the dollars or the publication of the Club of Rome report. And I'm not really able to explain why all of this is happening between 1871 and 1872, but there seems to be some mutation between the way time is measured and the way our place in universe that is quite striking. Everyone knows the famous melting clocks by Dali. The work was called The Persistence of Memory. And Dali was following those things closely, and he reinterpreted this in the 50s when Heisenberg's influence replaced the influence of psychoanalysis, and so he called the second painting disintegration of the persistence of memory. With those melting clocks, I tend to see an acceptable representation of blockchain. This kind of struck me. Last thing, sui generis hours. so from its own species. Very often we hear, what is Bitcoin as a type of money? Is it public, private, commercial? And my answer is, Bitcoin is sui generis time. As before trains, computers asked for a time that was compatible to them, that was native even. And today, beyond GPS time, there is also Google time, where leap seconds are defined according to a d-1 fraction. Time stamping is expressed according to POSIX time in continuous seconds in the 1st of January 1970, and it is more or less defined according to UTC. But the succession of time-stamped blocks creates this sui generis temporality. You can say, I will be doing this at the 900,000th block. Now, this system has to survive to the 19th of January 2038 bug. But the transition to a time stamping over 64 bits would push the deadline, which is on a Sunday, 4th of December, to a year that is 21 times the age of the universe. So Satoshi maybe anticipated this, and the time stamping starts on the 1st of January 1917. So we have a bit more time until 2106, and looking at this room, I believe you will not be there to see what happens in 2106. Is this the end of time? I would like to quote my Bitcoiner friends. Today it will be Marco, and he might see this on YouTube one day. So the way he talks about halving, there is a countdown, you see the amount of blocks, there's some euphoria, and then nothing really happens on the D-Day. The protocol happens as planned. So there is something that's continuous, maybe sui generis, but continuous, and nothing really happens, says Marco. So everything is all right. Is this the end of watches? Even though the Geneva people became experts of watches, it was only opportunistic. Many jewelers saw the Reformation coming and decided to start manufacturing watches, but it still remains a precious item, and it's so expensive that it stimulates the demand. It's a rare piece of art for Vacheron, it's an exclusive creation for connoisseurs, for Audemars, and the most expensive watch in the world for Piaget. Since many of my friends, considering the price of a Bitcoin, are not able to buy a Piaget watch, this watch is also technical, marketing, and aesthetic revolution. Fashion does not go out of fashion. So we are at a stage where we do not need figures anymore. We can only see that there is a pipe that indicates the 3. Another thing, and here I will use the motto of Patek Philippe, who also seems to have wanted to make the most expensive watch in the world. A watch doesn't tell you the time, it tells you who you are. And side note, this watch as well. And Vacheron Constantin also engraved a sword on a watch, which is the symbol of an object that is dated and useless, but still going very well. Thinking that there would be some watchmakers in the room or online, I spared you foreign watches, but there is probably the most expensive Bitcoin watch, with a to the moon and a P in the Earth system. This is an American watch, so I would like to tell Swiss watchmakers not to forget Bitcoin.
Quelques idées de lecture.
A few
Je recommande vivement
reading
ceux qui
suggestions
s'intéressent au
for
petit
all those who are
Olivier
interested.
Marchand,
I will recommend
Il est
Olivier Marchand's
extrêmement
book,
facile à lire,
le
extrêmement
30 février, very easy to read,
d'anecdotes
very funny,
croustillantes.
with a lot of
Ne rentrez pas dans le
interesting,
cadre de cet exposé.
interesting
Je recommande
anecdotes
aux courageux et qui ont,
for the bravest, for those who have some time this summer. I would recommend L'heure qu'il est by David Bland. He's an academic. This is a 500-page book, and I hadn't read something so interesting in a very long time. And for those who prefer literature, I would recommend Fernando Trias de Bes's novel, Le Vendeur de Temps. This is more for Bitcoiners than for watchmakers, but this shows how time is money.
Je donne mes deux adresses sur X.
My
Cryptosaurien
two
pour ce qui est
addresses on X, Cryptosaurien for everything crypto-related, and Historien Croco for everything history-related. Thank you.
j'ai volé Lionel de 5 minutes. Tout éteint. Ou alors on m'avait dit 50 minutes. Ça marche plus. Non, je sais pas.
1, 2.
Ça marche? Ah oui, pardon. Est-ce qu'il y a une question?
Are there any questions?
Rien. Bon.
S'il n'y a pas de questions,
If there are no
faire
questions,
5 minutes
we
de
will
pause.
take a 5-minute break,
Puis ensuite, on enchaînera.
and then we will move on. Thank you very much for this introduction.
Il y avait une question.
Oh, there is a question over there.
Oui, mais pour l'enregistrement. Mais oui, vas-y.
Microphone for the speaker.
Non, l'énergie, c'est plutôt 73. Hein.
Energy is more 73. Energy is the 6-day war, focused by the PEP.
Le rapport du Club de Rome est antérieur.
So the Club of Rome report predates that.
Les pétro-monarchies l'ont lu
Maybe
et se sont aperçus
petro-monarchies read this and saw that it was possible to pressure the Western world with the price of oil. But there clearly is debasement by Nixon, and that is due by his inability to buy gold back because he issued too much paper money to fund his war in Vietnam, and the willingness of some Westerners, mainly General de Gaulle, but also the English, because the ship that is traveling to New York is British, it's not French. And there is also this reflection by physicists. Physicians. But there are also some confusing things about history, why great thinkers are all from the 6th century, even though they didn't know each other. So I noted this correlation, or it's over 2-3 years, and I will keep thinking about this. But if anyone has ideas, I'm happy to hear them.
Une autre question?
Any other question? Well, I think we should be mindful about timekeeping.
On prend 5 minutes de pause et ensuite on
So,
enchaînera.
thank you.
Allez pas trop loin.
We'll do a short break. Please don't stray too far away.
À tout à l'heure pour
There's still
le
pain au chocolat. See you later for the next panel.
Voilà. Après cette introduction philosophique.
Thank you. So we had a philosophical introduction to time and value, thanks to Jacques Favier.
On va passer la parole
And we'll now move on
à un panel qui va
to a panel
traiter du génie de la machine.
They will look at the genius of the machine.
Informations pour ceux qui ne sont pas de la Chaux-de-Fonds et qui aimeraient pouvoir.
Just a few pointers. For those who aren't from La Chaux-de-Fonds and who want to visit the town, there's a train that you can embark on at 1 p.m. It'll be on the plaza in front. We'll organize it, but this is just for you to know. And there's also an art exhibit. It displays art from artists who work on Bitcoin. It's upstairs, and there's also watchmaking pieces. Thank you for being here, and I'll give you the floor now. Thanks, Lionel, for organizing the event.
Merci à tous d'être là.
Thanks, everyone. I think we can make a start. I'm going to quickly introduce myself, but this isn't about me. I'm known as Ajelex on social media. I work for Plan B Network. We're a business that provides education on Bitcoin through an online platform and initiatives around the world. I personally am coming back from El Salvador, where I was able to work on initiatives to help the local government to teach its citizens, high schoolers and academia about Bitcoin. Plan B Network is also present in Switzerland, in the Lugano canton. I'll be going there next week. Switzerland is clearly a place where a lot is happening around Bitcoin. And I know this conference because it's one of the first that I attended when I started to work on this. It was in 2022, I believe, and that's why I'm very happy to be up here on the stage now. It's my pleasure today to moderate a panel with Fanis Michalakis. He's from Ellen Market. He is a Bitcoiner himself and an expert in the field. And then Samuel Guillioz, next to him, he's also an expert, but in the field of watchmaking. He's an independent watchmaker. As I prepared for this, as a Bitcoiner, I realized I didn't know much about watchmaking, so I did a bit of research to understand what being a watchmaker was about, to understand how watches work, and I think our public here today is spread among people who know Bitcoin and others who know watchmaking, and by having speakers from both sides, we'll be identifying links, bridges between the two worlds. One way to highlight the link between the two is this sentence from Satoshi Nakamoto. In this document, we propose a solution to the problem of double spending by offering a timestamp system to generate a computational proof of transaction. Bitcoin is clearly linked to time, and that's a start for us. I'm going to give you the floor to hear a little bit about who you are. Samuel first. Thanks. It's a pleasure for me to be here and to give you the context about watchmaking. I was trained as a watchmaker. I'm also a designer and builder. I spent a few years working for big names in the watchmaking sector in Geneva. I worked in workshops, for example, the workshop that made the most complicated watch in the world. So there were working spaces that were particularly technical. I'm going to try to explain things efficiently to help everyone understand.
Dans les grandes marques horlogères, j'ai décidé de quitter un peu cet univers
After
confortable.
that time with the big names, I left that zone of comfort and launched my own brand, Kauri.
C'est une marque horlogère indépendante.
It's an independent watchmaking brand. I think we'll be coming back to it. The idea is to offer really unique pieces, unique with the case, and on the creative side and technical side. The last model that was launched this year, and the brand has existed for 5 years, is a very technical one. The case is in different materials. The display is intriguing. We can come back to it.
Donc moi je m'appelle Fanis, je suis
My name is Fanis.
Bitcoin depuis 2019.
I've been really passionate about Bitcoin since 2019-2020. Back then, I was still studying, so I came into it through the associative sector, and then I really enjoyed educating the public about Bitcoin, and I've been working at Ellen Market, which handles a trading platform for Bitcoin. I'm not going to delve into details. That's not the idea for our panel today. So my profile is also technical, but the idea today is to give you something understandable and to help you understand the workings of watches and Bitcoin. I would like for each of you to give us the time. What time is it in your individual sectors or in your individual mediums? So Samuel, what time is it? The watch is on the first floor because I only have one prototype, but I can tell you it's 10:50 on a Friday, 28 June. And Fanis, what's the height of block? You don't have it? Okay, I can look it up for you if you want. I just wanted to start by giving the time through the two different systems.
La hauteur de bloc est 849 795. Et voilà, on va
the block height is 849,795.
Que toi t'observes entre Bitcoin et le temps.
Fanis, what's the link between Bitcoin and time?
Et comment lui navigue justement ce
and how does that fit in to how Bitcoin works and deals with the time problem?
Finalement, ça revient à la citation que tu as donnée de Satoshi.
I mean, we go back to the quote you gave from Satoshi Nakamoto. He explains that it's a timestamp system from peer-to-peer. Why do we need to understand what the timestamp system is about? The purpose of Bitcoin is to have a cash system, a peer-to-peer cash system online. It's actually more complex than it seems. If I try to pay with banknotes to Samuel, well, I just hand him banknotes. I no longer have them, he has them, and the transaction happened. But if you go online, the problem is that the only transactions that we can do are copy-paste. So we know how to copy something from somewhere and paste it somewhere else, but we don't know how to actually move it in the online space. So when I try to do the same thing, I have my notes, I copy them, and I transmit it to Samuel, but Samuel has no way of knowing I didn't keep a copy. And what keeps me then from spending the same banknotes twice, from spending them again with Ajelex tomorrow? So we need to find a way to have the same thing that we have in the physical realm again.
Et traditionnellement, on fait ça avec un serveur central, une banque finalement.
And historically, we've done this with a central server, a bank,
détruire en fait les billets
who
quand je les transfère pour en générer de nouveaux.
guarantees
Par
that
exemple,
the
je dis,
banknotes are destroyed when new ones are generated. So when I give money to Samuel today, I do it through the bank, and the bank is the one that acknowledges that the banknotes were given and that destroys the original ones.
Et on peut s'assurer que je ne puisse pas faire ce qu'on appelle une double dépense.
This is to ensure that I can't do what we call double spending.
La banque, c'est qu'en gros, si je reviens demain et que j'essaye de payer
The role of the bank is that if tomorrow I try to pay Ajelex with the same banknotes, the bank has the record that I already spent them.
Donc c'est pour ça qu'on a besoin pendant très longtemps d'avoir un
That's why for a long time we've needed this central intermediary in transactions.
Et retrouver les
The point of that intermediary was to prevent the double spending and to emulate the same system as with cash money. So Bitcoin has tried to do the same, but without the central intermediary, that is the bank. And it did so by creating a centralized timestamp system. This precise system timestamps the transaction, and so if I try to do the same spending in a following block, everyone has access to the information that it was already done. And everyone can see that I'm not able to do that same spending again. So that's where time comes in. We might be coming back to this, but another interesting thing is that with clocks, it's difficult to have shared time, uniform time between all of the different servers. There's different internet times, so computers might be slightly asynchronous. And Jacques Favier mentioned this in his introduction. With Bitcoin, we have this new way to measure time. And maybe it's slightly less accurate. Bitcoins or blocks are generated every 10 minutes. But the point with this system is everyone is synchronized and everyone agrees on what time the transactions happened. And it's a way for everyone to be on the same page anytime a new block is created. Great. So that was for the Bitcoin part. And how time plays a role in Bitcoin. And now, Samuel, how does a watch work? Can we start seeing differences between how a watch works and how things happen in time? Sure. Well, the principle is simple. There's an energy, there's a metallic spring that's compressed, that gives the watch its energy. The energy is transmitted through a watch train. So there's many watch trains that multiply the energy, and then at the end of the chain you have an organ that's regulating all of this. That's where you do the setting. And it's what helps the watch be accurate. It's what determines whether or not it is accurate. It all depends on the upstream work. For example, what's done with the tooth. So everything is made so that that compressed spring blade gives maximum energy to the rest. You have axes that maintain wheels. The wheels pivot in synthetic ruby. It's not a precious gemstone ruby. They're synthetic rubies. And this helps with the dynamic. This is what determines how efficient it is. It's not the actual stone that determines it. The watchmaker is always trying to get his watches to be more accurate.
Telle précision en fait, ça dépend vraiment de la position. Si elle est en verticale, elle n'aura pas la même précision.
The accurateness depends on whether the watch is horizontal or vertical.
se caler au mieux au niveau de la seconde, en fait.
The watchmaker tries to be as close to the second as possible. He wants a minute that's 60 seconds long, not like 60 seconds and a few microseconds.
C'est vraiment d'arriver à être le plus précis possible. Et c'est là qu'on rejoint.
The idea is really to be as accurate as possible.
C'est ça.
And that's what's close to your blocks, right? They're 10 minutes, but they're not always exactly 10 minutes. You're trying to reach that value, but you never consistently, perfectly reach it. For us, that value is a second, and for you, it's those 10-minute blocks. So, if I understand correctly, your watch needs to be readjusted once in a while because there's been these intervals, or is it reliable? Your watch. Well, my watch is pretty reliable, very reliable. That's the case of Swiss watches generally. We use oil to diminish that that friction. You need the oil. And that's when what we do when we service it. We disassemble, we oil it. At most, the watch might take a little bit of, might register some delay because the oil has congealed, but that's the worst. So Bitcoin works with readjustment of the difficulty, right? On average, blocks are unblocked every 10 minutes. But if the interval starts to be too great, there's a way to adjust with difficulty so that you came back to 10 minutes. Is that an analogy that makes sense? Sure, yeah.
Pour expliquer peut-être pourquoi est-ce qu'on fait cet ajustement, comment est-ce qu'on fait pour avoir cette...
It could be useful to explain why we have to adjust.
Entre deux blocs qui est de 10 minutes.
Because we aim for that average 10-minute interval. The idea is that Bitcoin miners, people who do a lot of computing, and I mean tens of thousands of calculations per second. So you take a number, a random number, you put it through a mathematical calculation, and you see how long it takes you to get a result. The only way to know how to proceed is to use a lot of random numbers. And once someone finds a number that works, so it's like someone who found the winning ticket in the lottery, that's what allows the publication of a new block, the latest block in the blockchain. And if there's a lot more miners computing, if you have a lot more calculations happening every second, then you reach the golden ticket quicker. So if you have more machines on the network, you start going back, you start reaching an average time of 8 minutes instead of 10. Or if you have less machines, you go to 12 minutes on average. So what we do is, in the network, we're looking at the last 2 weeks. So on the 2016 latest blocks, you look at what was the average interval between two blocks, and then if we find that that average time was 8 minutes, we try to make the calculation a bit more complex so that it takes more time, and vice versa. If we find that the time has been 12 minutes, we try to make the calculation a bit easier so that we come back closer to 10 minutes. But it's very rare that we have exactly 10 minutes between two blocks. It's really the ideal. We try to reach it as close as possible.
Et d'ailleurs, si on voit d'ailleurs une courbe,
and actually, if you look at a chart of the various blocks that are found, we didn't show the curve, but we could see that blocks are found with more than 10 minutes, sometimes consecutively. And you can see that there is some kind of oscillation. But if you step back and you look at the curve from afar, you can see that the 10 minutes are actually preserved.
plus on recule, plus on voit qu'il y a une précision justement
And
sur ces...
the further away you go, the more you see that there is some accuracy. And it's quite interesting because if you look at this curve, you can really directly see the computing power for Bitcoin mining. For instance, when there was the exodus of Chinese miners in 2021, so the Chinese government more or less banned Bitcoin. There were more restrictions on the sale of electric power to mining farms, and so the Bitcoin activity moved from the US to from China to the US, and so you needed to put the containers on ships. So it took a few months, and you can really see on the curve of the average block time, you can see that for a few weeks, this average block time, until there's a new judgment, it showed a spike because there was part of the network that was actually removed during that exodus. So it really shows the state of the network at a precise moment. Would you agree with the fact that miners, in a way, are time stampers? Could that be an analogy that makes sense for you? Because that's kind of the thread that I wanted to follow for the next part of the discussion. Samuel, in the watchmaking industry in Switzerland, you are an independent watchmaker. This is something that I discovered by researching you a little. Could you explain to us what independent watchmaking is? Well, as independent watchmakers, we don't really have a lot of means to exist. We don't have many marketing resources, and very often we tend to only see well-established big brands that have been there for hundreds of years for some. But those brands, they are part of an economic movement. There are big groups that contain several brands. While working in those kinds of groups, and as someone who's passionate about watchmaking, I couldn't really find my place. We were making watches, but mostly we were making money, and I couldn't really identify with this. So it was more about profitable projects than ambitious projects that really are close to watchmaking, the theory and the technique of watchmaking. So this is why 5 years ago I decided to create my own brand, to become an independent watchmaker, to create watches with character, to have a different vision of horology, and start from scratch and see what I could do with my projects. Since watchmaking school, I had a few ideas in my head, and I really wanted to design this and maybe create a first prototype and see if there is enthusiasm for what I do, if people understand what I'm doing. It all started in June 2019, so 5 years on, I was able to release a new model. So it's really about offering something different. And that's the strength of independent watchmakers. Each one has their own vision of watchmaking. As human beings, we are all different, so it's also about saying there are not just classical watches. A big watchmaking brand cannot take the risks that an independent watchmaker can take. So we want to take risks, we want to go for ambitious projects, we will challenge ourselves, and this is an adventure, really. This is really the key word here, an adventure. So since you work alone, what really makes a difference with the way you manufacture a watch as an independent person? How is this different to being part of a big group? I'm more connected to the person who will want to buy a Kauri watch. There will be a direct discussion. So it won't be an investor saying, we're going in this direction because the market wants it, or anything like that. So I can be more candid in my in my approach. This is a passionate approach. Passion comes first, and then of course it needs to be viable economically. This is also important. How long do you need to work on a specific model? How many pieces do you hope to create each year? Being an independent watchmaker, how many pieces do you hope to build? And how many customers do you hope to be able to serve? It really depends on the time. When I started Kauri, I had a limited budget, but we needed to use that for our first project. And then selling those first pieces helped me build a more ambitious piece, and so on and so forth. So in the future, I would like to be able to manufacture very creative watches at prices below 10,000 francs, as well as very complex watches, and going to watches that cost several hundreds of thousands of francs. So it is also about taking into account customers' demand. That's what's important with independent watchmaking. We meet people in the workshop, we can discuss, we can create a personalized project, which is impossible in major houses. For me, that is possible. Depending on the budget, we can discuss, we can develop something. And an independent watchmaker very often is versatile. I'm not alone. I have subcontractors that are there to support me, to advise me, but I am the one who is at the helm of the whole process. I have to do project management, to work on building some components. I have to work on assembly, so it's not just one job, it's a whole breadth of works, but that's what's interesting. And from a marketing point of view, how to present the watches, how to showcase them on the other side of the planet. It's my job also to try and find solutions there. I have no marketing budget, so how can I proceed? I have to offer things that are different, and for those there will be that will be able to resonate even across the world. And I wanted to use those experiences that you mentioned. There was a link that I saw, which might be a bit far-fetched, but you're an independent watchmaker, and there's something that we tend to see in the Bitcoin universe. We are seeing that Bitcoin mining is not devoid of debate. There's a strategic aspect with decentralization, the independence of the network. And so I could see some connection here. And Fanis, I wanted to ask you to explain to us what is at stake with mining and in the way it gives the network some independence.
Ouais. Ok. Parce qu'effectivement, dans Bitcoin, ce que j'avais expliqué brièvement tout à l'heure, donc c'est qu'on.
What I explained with Bitcoin earlier is that we try to have one miner amongst the tens of thousands of miners, one that finds one block every 10 minutes. So this miner ran computers to run many calculations in a short time, so that and made sure that there was enough computers and enough power, and so this miner has to be rewarded for this, and the miner is rewarded with Bitcoin. So there is one part of newly created bitcoins that are given to this miner, and there are also the transaction fees that help pay the miner. But as for a small independent miner, and this goes back to the independence component. If it's a small miner, and if the miner only has 0.01% of the computing power, the miner will only find 0.01% of the blocks. So there will be energy consumption constantly, but there will be a reward. once every 10,000 blocks. So the miner should be able to continue paying for its electric power in order to take the reward and be able to sustain themselves. So many independent miners, in order to reduce this variability, will join as a mining pool, as a cooperative, and they will aggregate their computing power so that many independent miners can represent 1% of the network, and so they can find one block every 100 blocks, and this is easier to manage these operational costs. But the issue this leads to is that it doesn't work like a winemaker cooperative. You can have healthy governance relations between members of this cooperative, but for Bitcoin cooperatives, it's a bit different. For now, it is the manager of the cooperative who will decide which transactions are put into the mined block, so that gives them some power. Some transactions can be censored if they want that. So this is this does not match the philosophy of Bitcoin mining. So there is some tension between, on the one hand, large cooperatives that have more economic efficiency and independent miners that are smaller but have some level of independence and can defend or stand for their own ideals. But for cooperatives, more and more, also with mining moving to the US, very often those cooperatives are subject to economic imperatives. Sometimes they are listed on the stock exchange, and so there is a loss of the spirit of creation, of the why, to the benefit of something that is only aiming at making money. So with Bitcoin mining with large pools, there is a bit of a shift where the aim is to make money, and trade-offs are made on network censorship and things like that. And so today there are movements of people who decide to mine alone, accepting the risks associated, financial risks. So they decide to accept the risks with a lot of variability in the profit that can be made while mining. But sometimes there are solo miners who will find a block. I don't know if you know about the BTAX project, things like that. That's the closest connection I could make with an independent watchmaker. So in a very simple way, could you explain to us where a project like this comes from? What's in the mind of someone who carries out a project like BTAX? What does this represent? The world of Bitcoin mining has industrialized a lot. Bitcoin mining machines are specifically built for Bitcoin mining. They are optimized for that purpose. They can carry out a lot of calculation with consumptions that's becoming lower and lower. But those machines are also optimized to end up in large data centers. So they will release a lot of heat, they will be very loud, so that does not work for someone who wants to mine Bitcoin in their house. So there was someone who thought, we will take one of those large machines and we will remove the chips. There are something like 380 chips in a recent machine, and we will just have one chip and we will mine with only one chip. So the advantage is that the consumption is lower about that of a phone charger. There is no ventilation, so there is no issue with noise. So the idea is that rather than you need to have a machine and be a professional to run it, we'll have small machines that anyone can run with really low power consumption. It's as if your charger was plugged on all year long. That will cost you maybe 5 cents. And if you're lucky, you will maybe mine one block and you will be able to collect the hundreds of thousands of dollars that this represents. And so you can have a chance of winning that is similar to the chance of winning you have with regular lotteries. So that helps having those independent miners that sometimes are also open to mining at a loss because they're not motivated by financial gains, but by the idea of Bitcoin being a neutral, decentralized network as much as possible. And here we can really see the connection with watchmaking. It's about stepping out of a traditional system and do things out of passion. This is about being part of something, part of an adventure. I believe this is indeed the connection. I think it's really great to be able to see so many similarities between worlds that are so different. Yes, when I stepped into the Bitcoin world, it was because of a person who came to the workshop and said, I made money thanks to Bitcoin, but I don't want to buy myself a Rolex watch. Even though I thought that someone like that, because they want to show that they've made it, they would buy a Rolex watch. But no, this person came to Kauri, wanted to understand the world of independent watchmakers, because he could see that connection. And as soon as we started discussing, we were really able to relate to each other. We could see that we were going through the same things, me with watches and him with Bitcoin. Back then, I was a bit reluctant to step into that world, as many people are, and he's the one who made this more understandable to me, and I understood things. And the first watch I sold in exchange for Bitcoins was this person, and this person is in El Salvador. I told them that I was doing this panel, but they couldn't be there. It's funny that they were in El Salvador. I don't know if you were together when there was the transaction, or if you did the transaction remotely. He was still living in Geneva back then, but he really developed the tool so that I could really have that portfolio, so that I'm not tied to any platform. So there was really something well done, and I could really see the interest, how it was better than going through a platform. A few days ago, we spoke on the phone, and you explained the watchmaking universe to me. You explained that there was some confidence and trust in the approach of coming to see you, to develop something that has a certain cost. Could you explain to us the relationship that you have with a customer that would come to you? How do you reassure such a client? Because there is also the idea of the value of a watch, which is very important. Yes, that's why some people will turn to big, well-known brands, and sometimes it's even a bit of a speculative approach. Rolex, Patek, some pieces requires years of waiting. It's a bit better now, but once you receive the watch, you can sell it the next day for twice, 3 times the price. So there is a lot of speculation, and that's a bit more nuanced with independent watchmaker. But some clients when they come to see me, they ask me, will this watch increase in value? Is this some economic stability with this purchase? I always tell them it is my work in the future that will lead to this watch increasing in value or not. And so this is also a bet that people are taking. That's why it's important to have this trust, to make sure that people are reassured and want to sponsor this adventure because they identify to what is being done. So they're also betting on you in a way. Yes, when you buy a watch from an independent watchmaker, this is a bet. And things can really boom very quickly, but you can also disappear. There are many independent watchmakers that do not make it economically, and they have to file for bankruptcy. But it still is a beautiful watch, and we want to create the most beautiful watch possible. We all dream of success. We all want to have customers everywhere in the world, but the sad reality is that very often big brands tend to asphyxiate us, so it's a daily fight. How many people does it represent, independent watchmaking in Switzerland? This is difficult to tell in terms of amount of brands or amount of people who are like you, trying to do something different. I don't know if you can provide an estimate. I couldn't, but there are more and more people doing this. Independent watchmaking creates a lot of enthusiasm because big companies create watches that are just a reproduction of a model from the previous year. So we really try to stir the interest of people and want to offer them something different, and that's why there are many ongoing projects. I think there are hundreds of projects per year, hundreds of brands created every year, but there are many brands that also die every year. So there are few lucky ones, but it's very interesting because there's a lot going on. I spoke with collectors recently who said that that there were some projects, and collectors say that they have never received so many projects as over the past few years. They receive projects every week, and they are almost flooded with projects by independent watchmakers. It's very interesting because there are many proposals, many things offered, but everyone needs to be able to exist. That's the aim. Everyone is offering something unique, and so everyone should be able to exist, but in the reality it's not always the case. That's an excellent explanation of what independent watchmaking is. This is a word that I discovered over the past few weeks. I think we had an overview of the way Bitcoin and watchmaking works. Is there anything you would like to add on the way your respective systems works? I know there is also time for questions from the audience. Maybe there will be questions either on Bitcoin or on watchmaking, but is there anything you would like to add on the topic? I just have one question on the fact that the future value of the watch is also a bet on the future. Maybe there's the reverse effect. If the creator, if the designer is not doing anything anymore, operating, if there are only 5 pieces remaining in the world, can it work? Well, the brand would still have to exist in a way, because that would mean that there is no brand image anymore, and this is always important. There are many projects that technically are good, that are interesting, but the question is how to make people interested in the history. This is what will make the difference between a watch and another. What is the history of the watchmaker? How do they build or manufacture their watch? Some watches are built from A to Z by one manufacturer. I have a machine that dates back to 1849, which is extremely accurate, which is great, and so I try to build most of the components myself. There's a lot of ornaments. Everything that we learn in terms of machining, using of the components, this is what will lead to interest or not, in addition to the history. Thank you. So now I turn to the audience to hear maybe some questions or comments. I will try to give the microphone to whoever.
Bonjour et merci beaucoup pour.
Good morning. Thank you very much for the two presentations. I have a question to Fanis. Could you maybe explain the technical aspect? Today, it is possible to pay with bitcoins, with smartphones, using QR codes. There is a new technology that's more and more well-known, which is LNP, LN withdrawal. With a NFC tag, you can pay only by tapping. We also have contactless payment bracelets. Some put them in watches. Many people will also pay with the Apple Watch. Could we imagine a world with an NFC card, with a beautiful independent watch that will help having a Bitcoin portfolio within the watch without this being obvious? I like the idea of having money hidden somewhere. So if we can put some sats in a watch, maybe you can increase its value and you can use it to pay as a last resort. So maybe Fanis for the technical aspect, and then maybe we can see what are the limitations of adding something like that in the watch. For the technical aspects, I think you summarized the situation quite well. It is possible to pay with the same technologies as with bank cards or smartphones. You can have the same technology in a watch, but for now it's watches such as Apple Watches. I can't really imagine mechanical watches having this type of technology because there would need to be a supply of power, and usually automatic watches cannot do that. There needs to be a power supply. I just thought about it, but not actually. You can have NFC cards where it's just a circuit, but that is supplied with energy by the payment terminal, so you do not need to have a power supply. There might be some issues with the magnetism. The mechanical watches do not like magnetic fields, so I do not know if it would be possible. You would have a magnetic field, so this would not be the best solution, but then it's still possible to use the smartphone to check the time if the watch is no longer accurate enough.
Moi, c'est plus
maybe one comment that's interesting considering your two professions. There is the issue of energy. For both professions, the miner needs energy to validate blocks. So you need that energy, and finally, everyone who wears a real mechanical Swiss watch will also spend energy to charge the watch, be it a watch with a balance or another type of watch. You will need the proof of work for the watch to show the time, and miners will also spend energy to validate blocks.
Tout à fait, oui. Ouais.
Exactly, yes.
Dans la montre mécanique, ce qui est intéressant.
In the mechanical watch,
alors c'est pas forcément du coup lié au Bitcoin, mais c'est
now that might not be related to Bitcoin, but
qu'on a actuellement.
It's one of the few non-connected objects that we have. I have a lot of clients who wear the Apple Watch during the week because they need it for work, but then during the weekend they really want to unplug, and they want their watch to recharge the watch. They want their wrist to recharge the watch rather than have to plug in.
Non, mais c'est pour la vidéo.
C'est de nouveau pour
About the watch again, what kind of applications could you see Kauri have in the future in line with Bitcoin? Could you use the watch to indicate the timestamp situation with Bitcoin? How could we use the measure of time for Bitcoin in this way? I think we mentioned the traceability of elements to ensure that products have a certain value. You have an independent brand, so you can do that. What do you see happening?
J'avais essayé justement avec, à l'époque, en tout
Well,
cas, de pouvoir
I tried
avoir un lien avec le client final, en fait.
Before,
Lui qu'il ait un
I wanted to have
sur la
a
blockchain,
connection to the end user.
où il peut,
I want them to have
ajouter des
a
informations. En tout cas,
space
il y avait des informations
on
de
the
la montre,
blockchain
rajouter
where
des choses supplémentaires,
they could add
par l'intermédiaire d'un QR code,
additional information through a QR code. The QR code would be engraved very discreetly on the watch with an application. This is in the research stage. But this is more to ensure connection between the producer and the client rather than for transactions. Maybe you have more specific question?
Moi, c'est peut-être pour Fanis, parce que du coup, on entend souvent.
My question is more for Fanis.
Faire de la traçabilité d'objets dans le réel.
We often talk about traceability in the real world through a blockchain and maybe through Bitcoin.
Tu peux nous expliquer peut-être les limitations techniques que ça a?
Could you tell us what are the technical limitations when we're trying to establish this link between something material in the real world and something in the blockchain, virtual?
Les limitations, c'est la principale.
Sure. Well, for me, the main limitation
on a beau faire la traçabilité dans un registre numérique,
is that sure you do the traceability in an online ledger.
Librement consultable, ce qui est en fait
the ledger is open to consultation.
Mais il y a toujours la question du lien entre l'objet physique et son double numérique.
But there's always a limitation between the material object and its digital double, because what's being processed is actually the digital double.
Une bijection, un lien continu en permanence entre l'objet réel et le double numérique.
It's hard to ensure a continuous link between the material good and its digital
et ça, c'est des sujets
double.
Voilà, sur tout ce qui est traçabilité, en fait, même sans blockchain, c'est souvent ça le sujet.
And that's the caveat for everything traceability-wise.
Disons que ça peut être un cas d'application intéressant. Il y a eu un moment
it could be an interesting application case. At some point, we imagined that just because there was a blockchain, then the follow-up and the traceability would be perfect. But actually, you had the problem of the data entry in the ledger. If the data entered is inaccurate, then having a blockchain to timestamp everything isn't really fixing things. So that's one of the main limitations. But for luxury objects, it could be interesting. And like Samuel says, it could help ensure a connection between the artisan and their buyer. And then the buyer would be a secondary market. It would be the watch that's connected to its original creator. That's something I'm experimenting with. I have a 3 mm wide holding device. And an app can read the imprint, link it to blockchain. The problem with the QR code was that it was too big for some pieces, and it wasn't necessarily aesthetically pleasing. So it's important to be able to hide it, but to still have the connection. Well, I was going to ask Fanis.
Qui inscrivent de la data. Et d'ailleurs, ça crée quelques débats pour.
Some users today enter data.
Le but de Bitcoin, est-ce que Bitcoin est fait pour ça? Est-ce que
and that's a problem for the purpose of Bitcoin.
Tu peux nous donner
is Bitcoin's aim to enter data? Could you tell us more about what that means and what's already happening in that regard? Sure, I mean, I'm not going to dwell on it because I know there's a panel this afternoon about it, and I want to make sure you guys are coming back to hear about it. The initial purpose is financial transactions, but really we can encode information in different ways with Bitcoin. And some ways take up less space in the Bitcoin space than others, and that's where we have debates and controversies. For some, Bitcoin's purpose is transactions, but we have these other usages, and for some this is parasitic. It alters the proper functioning of Bitcoin. Because if you have users using Bitcoin to enter random data, it does take up space. And then someone who needs to use Bitcoin for financial transactions because they don't have access to the international financial system because they're not with a bank, then that person cannot afford room in the block. And there's the issue of can we enter data in a clean way in the blocks to have an imprint of the data. There are things like timestamp that's been existing for as long as Bitcoin, and it helps you enter data in a clean way, even though it's very voluminous.
J'ai une autre question, juste ici.
I have another question here.
Merci pour la présentation.
Thank you for the presentation.
Donc, un peu pour le domaine
I have
un peu pour le
a double question for both the watchmaking and the mining sectors. You mentioned pools, so the spirit of cooperation. Last year, Open Movement came to present an open source movement. So for watchmakers, my question is, to what extent in independent watchmaking do you have the secrets of the conception? How much do you have cooperation between independent makers? Do you also have that secrecy, or are you prone to share, to pool resources? And then my question to the mining sector, I looked up Stratum V2, which, if I understand correctly, would give miners more options for the template of the block. Why is that not getting off the ground as quickly as I think it should? And maybe you could speak a little bit to that cooperative aspect of mining. Well, before, independent watchmakers were working individually, each in their silo, and they kept their secrets. But for a few years now, and that's what I've seen, there's been exchanges between us. The idea is for us to mutually help each other and for us all to progress. We have a shop here linked to a shop in Geneva, and through it, independent watchmakers are in relation with one another, and then you have other actors even. So this gives you a really rich palette. It's the only shop in Geneva that assembles all of the watchmakers in Geneva and in Switzerland and even a little further afield. Through this endeavor, we can meet, and it's a better way to work than to just be each of us in our individual workshops. So I used to work on my own, but I realized we really needed to help each other. That's the only way to move forward. everyone has their own direction anyway.
Les plus grands groupes horlogers.
And to what extent do you also exchange with big names in the watchmaking industry? Well, that doesn't really happen.
Justement, on n'a pas du tout la même philosophie.
We don't share the same philosophy.
Nous, on se rassemble en tant qu'horloger indépendant.
As independent watchmakers, we do form a group, but we're excluded from the biggest fairs. They're the exclusivity of some groups. But we're trying to create a dynamic to show that there aren't only those big groups, that we exist and we can have we have lots of interesting things to show.
Stratum V2, ça me fait penser à un lien intéressant sur le.
What you said about Stratum V2 reminds me of the fact that mining is now industrialized through ASIC machines. ASIC machines are very specialized. But before that, there was an entire phase where the first softwares incorporated something that relied on the CPU, which is a normal computer. So mining relied on the normal computer's process. And the GPU, the graphic card, helped the process. These first programs were very open source. They were shared. At the beginning we said we wouldn't use it because we wanted it to be uniform. See, graphic cards would paralyze the system and we didn't want that to happen. But there was the same sharing of information about the instruments we used to mine. Then you had another system that were more effective, and then we had ASICs. Or APICs in English.
Donc parce qu'avant sur les tout ce qui était GPU, etc. Vraiment tout était un peu accessible en open source, etc.
GPUs, in the first phases, everything was open source, but once we reached ASICs,
une feuille avec qui vient, un livret qui vous explique exactement quel voltage va là, quel voltage.
You had something that explained how things worked, where the voltage went.
Qui est énorme.
That was before. With ASICs, you had huge trade secret aspects. So we lost that we had at the beginning. It's become industrialized. And that's maybe similar to what's happened with watchmaking and the bigger brands. Stratum V2 is an update of the Stratum V1 protocol. It's what's used today for communication between the cooperative miners, the pool, and the miners that make up the pool. With the V1 version, the manager of the pool, so the cooperative director, if you want to maintain the analogy, they are the one that tells miners what to work on. And with Stratum V2, you have something more horizontal unfolding. Each miner is able to tell the pools about its block, and the pool can accept or reject the block. Why has that not gotten off the ground yet, you asked? Well, because the pools don't have a lot of engineers today. Usually you have maybe 1 or 2 engineers in the pools. And that's why it's taking time. But I think most pools aren't reluctant to that approach. This would have an effect with the regulatory framework. A government that wants to look at Bitcoin and alter its neutrality could ask a pool to reject some transactions because they're on the blacklist of government agencies. But if you have the miner-centered approach, it relieves the pools of that responsibility. So I think it's a lot about human resources.
Oui, c'est Jacques à nouveau. Je voulais proposer une réflexion sur les 10 minutes.
Jacques,
vous avez parlé tout à l'heure.
I wanted to go back to the 10 minutes to explain how it's being regulated.
Qui aussi, finalement, est une horloge. Je voudrais renverser la proposition.
And I want to invert things. The watch and the timer is a way to measure the performance of an athlete for the 100-meter track. I think the best ones on earth run them in 10 seconds. So if you have the runner, you know you have your 10 seconds. Then there's the physical component, which is why we say it's more or less 10 seconds. With the exponential law for time, say you have a bus. It leaves every 10 minutes. At the beginning, it's 10 minutes, but slowly that changes, especially at the end of the line, because there's chaos being introduced. So maybe the bus got the green light, maybe it had to wait at the stop. And so at the end, there's an interval. And the time you spent waiting for the bus doesn't give you an indication of the time left. That's what you have with Bitcoin. It's not watchmaker-like. It's not watch-like. You have a real revolution linked to security, because if those 10 minutes were actually 10 minutes, mathematically, the Bitcoin network would be less protected than with these exponential 10 minutes. With watches, I know there used to be uneven hours, even with devices. I don't know if a watchmaker could create a watch that has the same variation as a Parisian bus. Well, everything's possible. It all depends on the budget you have.
Non, après, la montre, elle a plutôt vocation, c'est vrai, qu'à donner, enfin, alors de manière
the point of a watch
imprécise, si on va vraiment
is to give you,
dans le
maybe inaccurately,
la mécanique, elle a une fréquence de 2,5 Hz à 5 Hz. On est voilà, dans des fréquences.
The usual watch has a frequency between 2.5 and 5 Hz frequencies.
Définir un temps précis. Et puis, la montre a elle-même son imprécision, en fait, on va dire.
And the watch has its own imprecision.
À essayer de coller à un temps qui serait...
But we're not trying to match time that is at its root imprecise.
Pour moi, elle serait pas utile dans ce cas-là.
For me, that watch wouldn't be useful.
Bonjour, merci pour la présentation et la table ronde et la discussion. Je reviens sur cette...
Thank you for the discussion, for the panel.
Pourquoi
I find the idea of the 10 minutes interesting. Why are we trying to keep that time lapse of 10 minutes? Who defined that standard? Well, that was designed by the creator of Bitcoin, Satoshi Nakamoto, at its beginning. The intention is that we want it to be frequent enough. When you're doing a Bitcoin transaction, more precisely when you receive a Bitcoin transaction, you want to make sure that it's definitive. And that's only from when there's a block. So you need to have frequent enough blocks. Otherwise, when I want to make a payment, I have to wait for the transaction of the day to see if the payment went through. And if it didn't, I have to wait for the next day. So you need to have a good enough frequency. But you don't want it to be too frequent. you want the blocks to have time to propagate in networks of computers that all have different levels of performance. They're spread over the entire world. We want to make sure that the information has time to propagate in the network and that the nodes in that network have time when they receive a transaction to verify that it's a valid block. So you just need more than time for propagating, also time for verifying. And that's why you have that tempo that's a little bit long. It's the compromise between propagation, yet aiming for regularity. Now, why 10 minutes exactly? I think that's a little bit arbitrary. Micro pour l'intervenant, s'il vous plaît. Mic for the speaker.
Donc ça, c'est un choix qui reviendrait à la communauté.
Well, that would be up to the community.
C'est la communauté des développeurs de Bitcoin. Donc
the community of Bitcoin developers, which is a living community, and there is not really a governance structure.
Non, parce qu'en fait, ils ne contrôlent pas du tout ce temps entre deux blocs de 10 minutes. Il leur est dicté par...
The 10-minute time-lapse isn't controlled, it's dictated by the level of difficulty, which governs how hard it is to find the winning ticket. And that's linked to the computing power of all the softwares mining for Bitcoin. The average time between the two blocks is calculated thanks to the 2016 preceding blocks. If you wanted to have 5 minutes instead of 10, you'd have to change things on the Bitcoin protocol itself. You'd need everyone to agree. If miners attempted to unilaterally change that, from the first difficulty adjustment, there'd be a difference between the difficulty target calculated by the miner and the difficulty target calculated by the nodes. And all of the counterparts in the system would reject the block of the miner attempting to unilaterally change it. So that change would be considerable, would carry a lot of meaning. There's also Moore's law. Spreading and verifying keeps increasing. It's been increasing as the network became less and less centralized, as we gained nodes in more remote regions, and as the different populations that use Bitcoin acquire infrastructure. But for now, the time for propagation is longer than it was in 2015.
Y a-t-il encore une autre question pour le panel?
Is there another question for the panel?
J'ai l'impression que non. Je regarde sur...
Seems to not be the case.
Ah si, on en a une. Attends.
Oh yes, we have one.
Ça, en réalité, on aurait pu choisir quelque chose de plus petit éventuellement.
We could have chosen a smaller number. That was also arbitrary.
Des ajustements trop souvent.
The idea was that we wouldn't have adjustments too often or too irregularly either. Satoshi wanted that the number not be too low, otherwise we'd spend our whole life making adjustments.
faire un ajustement que quand il y a effectivement une différence significative et pas juste quand il y a des aléas qui sont juste dus.
The idea is to make adjustments only when there's a considerable difference, not just any time there's fluctuations because of the statistical process. And it shouldn't be too high a number, because if you put 3 months between two adjustments, say the emission rate of blocks lowers greatly. Say lots of miners are unplugging. Well, in that case, today, since we have to wait for 2016 blocks to happen, instead of waiting for 2 weeks, we'd have to wait for 2016 days, say, if there was only 1 block a day. There's also stages, right? Stages of readjusting difficulty. Yes, sure, there's limits. So we're coming to the end of the panel. It looks like we don't have more questions. Can we find you on social media? Yeah, I spent a little bit too much time on Twitter. I'm Fanis Michalakis. M-I-C-H. Sure, and he also posts photos on Plan B Network, where he explains the Lightning Network and how it works. Same question for Samuel. Social media, or where can we buy your watches? Well, you can buy them at Watchmaker United in Geneva and in the workshop in Geneva. And then with internet, we had until recently Bitcoin payments available, but I'm waiting for the updates. And then you can find us on social media and on LinkedIn, Kauri Watches. It's the first media I use to communicate, to explain what I do, and to show you backstage. Thank you. Thank you for listening to us, and thank you to the Bitcoin Paradigm for hosting us. I looked at my reference. We're at the 849-1806 block. And I'll now invite you to a drink. It's the city of La Chaux-de-Fonds who's offering it. We thank them, we applaud them. So please go have that drink. There's also a meal after. Thank you for that panel. Now we are going into an informal setting. We can chat a bit, have a bite. And I'll remind you that at 1 p.m., if you want to visit the town with the train, with the visitor train, you can go to the plaza. There's the big tower in front. It will be a tour given in French, but also in English and in German. You'll have headsets. That way you can visit the town, which is listed on the UNESCO Heritage Sites list.